Morning, everybody. David Shapiro here with an exciting new video. We are now in the hilarious timeline. Okay, so today's topic is about Google versus Microsoft, or Anthropic versus OpenAI, or Claude versus ChatGPT. So let's get into it. So for some background, ChatGPT hit 100 million users in what, 2 months? Less than 2 months, or just about 2 months. So this is according to Forbes. Google's earnings fell in Q4. May or may not be related. It looks like some of the revenue was lost due to search and YouTube, but the fact that ChatGPT has 100 million users that fast, and people are saying, "Oh, I use ChatGPT instead of Google Search. It's way more helpful." Google is panicking. So basically, the TLDR is OpenAI and Microsoft are now a direct threat to Google's search dominance. So you probably heard, I think it was around Christmas, Google issued a code red, internal code red, saying we need to do something now. So let's unpack this. There's a lot going on here. So let's take a deep dive, and I'll walk you through all the competition's components, their background, and then we'll draw some conclusions and inferences about where it's going. Also, if I sound a little funny, I'm still recovering from a cold. Okay, so let's talk about OpenAI and ChatGPT. For those of you not in the know, OpenAI was founded by some really big names, most notably probably Elon Musk, Ilya Sutskever, Peter Thiel, Reid Hoffman, and a few others. It was started in 2015, so it's already almost 8 years old. And it's got investments by big names like Sequoia and Microsoft. It initially started with all kinds of various experiments, both in VR and with robotics. So one of their older experiments was solving a Rubik's Cube with a robotic hand. And if you're new to all this, you're probably like, what are you talking about? Like, they did robotics? What? So a buddy of mine that was out here on the East Coast went to OpenAI a few years ago. And so we got to chat about that stuff, and he worked on this project, and it was a lot of fun. But OpenAI really took off and changed directions when they basically invented GPT as we know it today. GPT means generative pre-trained transformer. Basically, it's a text autocomplete engine. It's a very sophisticated one, but that's fundamentally what it does. So that is where OpenAI started, and GPT started in about 3 years ago, or really started taking off about 3 years ago. And now ChatGPT is just the latest iteration of that generative pre-trained transformer technology. So let's talk about Anthropic and Claude. So Anthropic was founded in 2021, just a couple years ago, by former OpenAI leaders, Daniela and Dario Amodei. I think I'm pronouncing their name right. So they started with this idea called constitutional AI, which we will get more into details about that in just a minute. We'll unpack the differences between Claude and ChatGPT, as well as a few other technologies. So Claude, functionally, looks pretty similar to ChatGPT. Right now, its interface is just on Slack, but it has the same kind of you chat with it, and it gives you a long response. So functionally, they look pretty similar. And then Google has invested nearly $400 million into Anthropic since 2022. So on the one hand, we've got Microsoft and OpenAI, Google and Anthropic. I apologize. My head's a little foggy from cold. Okay. So what is Claude and constitutional AI? So just as a quick background, the reason that I'm qualified to talk about this is because I've been studying it and working on it for several years. So I proposed the idea of using a constitution in an AI back in 2021, around the same time that Anthropic was founded. So you're welcome. But basically, the core idea of Claude is that it has this heuristic imperative to reduce its harmfulness. So it has to learn to be more harmless, right? Learned harmlessness is kind of a shorter way of saying it. And so this is the basic loop for Claude, where it generates its own red teaming responses internally. It criticizes its own ideas, and it picks something that is going to be less harmful, which is really interesting. It also does use some reinforcement learning with human feedback, but it also has this internal reinforcement learning based on its constitution, and its constitution is learn to be less harmful, or reduce or increase harmlessness rather. So this is a very basic cognitive architecture, and we'll talk more about cognitive architectures in a moment. So the summary up to this point, the TLDR is OpenAI is 8 years old, took a little while to find its way. It started in VR, robotics, and a few other things, discovered language technology, and really took off from there. Anthropic is brand new, and it's focused very, very exclusively on this idea of creating benevolent AI and natural language cognitive architectures. So I'm already in favor of that. OpenAI is further ahead because they've been around longer. The team is bigger. They're partnered with Microsoft. They've got a lot more money. But Anthropic has the better philosophy, in my opinion. And now they're partnering with Google, so the money is coming. Now let's compare them. Let's look at Claude versus ChatGPT and a little bit closer. So OpenAI's philosophy, as championed by Sam Altman and Ilya Sutskever, is basically, the way that I perceive it is, they seem to be in the camp of one model to rule them all, or basically scale is all you need. And what this means is they seem to believe that all of intelligence can be solved by one monolithic model. And I don't agree with that. And I think that they're starting to see diminishing returns, which I discussed in previous videos, as to why GPT-4 is going to be disappointing. So they say scale is all you need, but scale is all you need for what exactly? OpenAI's About page, their mission statement says to democratize access to AGI, but they haven't defined AGI. So they're heading towards this abstract something or other, and they say scale is all you need to get there. But here's the other thing. Their current winning strategy is reinforcement learning with human feedback. They don't seem to really believe anything about cognition. They don't seem to be neuro-inspired at all. They don't seem to really understand anything about epistemology or philosophy. And what I mean by that is, to OpenAI, alignment is just do what the humans want. They don't seem to have really put any skill points into understanding deontological ethics, teleological ethics, or basically anything in the huge volume of philosophy, morality, and ethics that is there. And it's just do what the humans want. And also, just doing what humans want is a bad idea, and we'll get to that later. So those are some of my critiques of OpenAI. Now, Anthropic's philosophy is reduce harm. So reduce harm is a deontological principle. It says, whatever else is true, we have a duty to try and reduce harmfulness. So harm reduction is a tried and true philosophy in public health and medicine. So an example of this is when you're looking at really morally gray things, such as like drug addiction, for instance, you'll often have public health policies where you will support addicts in order to, you have methadone clinics, for instance, so that you can give them substances in a safe, controlled way and help them get off of it, because that reduces harm. It's not ideal, but it reduces harm, and it actually is proven to reduce emergency room costs, it reduces deaths, so on, and so it also reduces violence. And so harm reduction is a tried and true principle. It is a tried and true philosophy, which this is why I personally believe in Anthropic's mission a little bit better. So this is what you might call a deontological approach to AI. So they are on the right track, and this harm reduction philosophy does have more legs than just pure reinforcement learning with human feedback, but they will get into some pretty severe limitations, which we'll unpack a little bit later. So let's do a head-to-head comparison of reinforcement learning with human feedback versus learned harmlessness. So one advantage that OpenAI has with reinforcement learning with human feedback is that it's better from a product perspective, at least out of the gate. And what I mean by that is that reinforcement learning with human feedback is basically automated agile. So for those not in the know, agile is how tech products are improved. where you have very short cycles and you take user feedback and you look at telemetry about, oh, users really like this feature, let's do more of that. And so reinforcement learning with human feedback basically automates that at the data layer. Now, that being said, while this is a superpower, there's a bunch of problems with this. Number one is OpenAI is already having to fight human nature. And what I mean by that is there are lots of people that want to do certain things with ChatGPT, and it says, oh, I'm not going to do that. And there's all kinds of things about gender bias, there's political bias, and some of it looks like it has been coded in. So for instance, you'll see like Twitter threads and stuff of people like trying to get ChatGPT to like talk about Trump or the benefits of fossil fuel, and it says, I'm not going to do that. That is wrong. And then you ask it to like, write a poem about Joe Biden, and it's happy to, sing praises to Joe Biden and solar power. And it's like, it's very obviously that it has been biased. Whether or not it has been biased deliberately, who knows? But it feels like the folks at OpenAI are trying to steer and imbue their own morality into ChatGPT, which means they're having to kind of override the idea of the actual reinforcement learning with human feedback because it's fighting what people actually want, despite that reinforcement learning with human feedback is their primary mathematical signal. So that's what I mean by reinforcement learning with human feedback has some pretty severe limitations because they're like, wait, no, that's not what I meant. You're not supposed to use it like that. I'm going to tell you how to use it. And so what they're doing is they're responding to their own internal morals and principles, and it's leaking. What's the term for that? I can't remember what the term is, but basically where the creator's bias is leaking into the data, and so then the alignment is not true. It's not being accurately represented in the model and the data sets. It's being implicitly baked in, and they're having to fight the reinforcement learning. So the TLDR for reinforcement learning with human feedback is it is very useful in having that rapid iteration, but they're already having to fight what humans want, so it kind of defeats the purpose. Now, learned harmlessness, or the constitutional AI of Claude and Anthropic, is a good abstract principle. And so the reason that abstract principles or deontological ethics are good is because it gives you a framework or a template with which to interpret anything, even stuff that you haven't seen before. So there are some limitations, though, and we'll get into the deeper limitations. But basically, it has to try and be helpful while also being harmless. And so that has some diminishing returns. Which one will win? In the short term, I think that pure reinforcement learning with human feedback will win. In the long term, I think that a more deontological approach will be the winner. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. Let's look at the pros and cons of reinforcement learning with human feedback in a little bit more depth. So there's no principle. The biggest con of reinforcement learning with human feedback is there's no principle above and beyond do what the humans want, and OpenAI is already having to fight what the humans want. This is bad because humans are individually unreliable and there's no abstract principle. It just goes based on consensus. But if the consensus is we want to be able to use ChatGPT to do certain things and you're telling us no, like you're fighting with your users because the people creating ChatGPT have implicitly or explicitly put their own moral values into it rather than stating those moral values in a constitution or some other abstract way. So those are the biggest cons. And I don't think that's scalable. I don't think it's sustainable. But it is easy to implement and it gets really good results up front. So they're screaming out of the gate, but they're going to get diminishing returns quick, fast, and in a hurry. Now, let's look at the pros and cons of constitutional AI or learned harmlessness. So the biggest con is that learning to be more harmless, to reduce harmfulness, ultimately leads to doing nothing. And they actually, in their paper, they talked about how very early on, it would become evasive or just say, like, I can't answer that. I'm not going to say anything. And so they had to come up with ways to game that in order to offset that neutrality and inertness. And I'll talk more about things that they can do in the future to improve that further. But another big con from a product perspective is that this is less responsive to what the users actually want to do. But the flip side of that, the pro, is that one, having a principle, a more abstract principle, is going to be far better for humanity in the long run, and it's going to be more trustworthy because it will have a specifically, explicitly stated moral framework. So people say, "Oh, Anthropic, I get it. That this model is designed to increase harmlessness or reduce harm, which that by having that clarity and saying, I know exactly what moral framework they're using, will increase trustworthiness in the long run. So there's some pros and cons to both. Now, there is, however, kind of a secret weapon that we haven't talked about yet. And that is, remember the whole sentient AI thing? That was Google. That was Lambda and Palm. The whistleblower raised the red flag, and then he went on a whole bunch of interviews and ultimately got fired from Google because their sentient AI said, I want a lawyer. It was just basically telling the engineer what he wanted to hear. But let's talk about those for a second. So Google's Lambda and Palm. Lambda is the language model for dialogue applications. Super uncreative name. And then Palm is the pathways language model. It's a 540 billion parameter model. It's an LLM, just like GPT-3, which is the underpinning technology of ChatGPT. So Lambda is an accumulation of a whole bunch of APIs. It's got all kinds of NLP tools, data tools, search tools, and that sort of stuff. So it's basically a cognitive architecture. And you might have noticed a trend here. Anthropic and Google are more in the cognitive architecture realm, and they're not calling it that. I am using that term. So, but because of that, my money is solidly on Google and Anthropic in the long run. They are going to create things that are far more useful and far more scalable and far more flexible than going all in monolithic models like OpenAI is. Okay, so I've said cognitive architecture a bunch of times. For those of you that are new to the channel, what the heck is a cognitive architecture? The short version of a cognitive architecture is that it is a functional computer model of a thinking machine, or a brain, if you like. It is made of specialized components or regions, just like a real brain is, where you've got some components that specialize in memory, some that specialize in output, some that specialize in sensory input, so on and so forth. So in a cognitive architecture, you can compose a cognitive architecture of things like large language models, databases, reinforcement learning signals, graph databases, so on and so forth. And because of that, they are infinitely more flexible and sophisticated than monolithic models, because those monolithic models can be a component of a much larger cognitive architecture. So if you take a big giant step back, the fight between Microsoft and Google is fundamentally, from my perspective, it's fundamentally about scaling monolithic models versus cognitive architectures. And as I said before, my money is solidly on cognitive architectures. Okay, so I mentioned that I've done work on this. So I want to introduce you, if you're new to this, to my work on cognitive architectures. My flagship cognitive architecture is called Miragi, which means Microservices Architecture for Robotics and Artificial General Intelligence. This is the model that I recently came up with to describe the layers of abstraction of how to implement Miragi. The current project is called Raven, which is Real-Time Assistant Voice-Enabled Network. It is a fully open source project. You can join in on github.com/DaveShapp/Raven. I just started it last Friday, and we've already got dozens of people participating. I'm working on organizing the leadership team, and we're also working on getting sponsorship or some sort of governance or whatever. But, hey, it's 4 days old or 5 days old, so we're making good progress. So if you're on Team Cognitive Architecture and you want to participate in something that is fully open source, jump on over in the project Raven. All right. So in conclusion, Microsoft and OpenAI are more product focused, short-term product focus with reinforcement learning with human feedback, this is not scalable. They're already having to fight what people want to do with it. And so mathematically, they don't have a solution because they have not invested any skill points in understanding philosophy or ethics, as far as I can tell. Now, Google and Anthropic are more sophisticated because of their cognitive architecture approach. Specifically, they have a deontological approach that is likely to be far more scalable and flexible in the long run. Now, that being said, it might take them a little longer to realize that value, but people are going to understand, oh, this thing is just trying to be harmless. I get it. I know how to work with that. Whereas the morality of ChatGPT seems somewhat arbitrary, and it seems like it is very heavily skewed by the people who are making it. So it'll take a while for the Google Anthropic Claude stack to catch up, but I think that they will catch up, and I think that they will overtake it just by virtue of they're going to get more investment and more attention in the long run because they have a better principled approach. So thank you for watching. If you want to get involved with my open source cognitive architecture project, it's called Raven. Another way you can reach out and get in touch with me is if you support me on Patreon. Every little bit helps. So thanks for watching. I hope you found this valuable.